Okay, so welcome to part 2 of this series. So in the last video, we talked about how you're basically just a ball of compulsions just heading towards a decision. If you haven't watched that episode yet, none of this will make sense. So make sure you click right there to watch it, okay? Anyways, since this ball of compulsions has been practiced and trained for so long, it's very likely that these compulsions are stronger than your will to act differently in a consistent way enough to make long-term change. And this is why we can't rely on the rational level to make a change. We have to change them on an emotional level to adopt a new idea and new perspectives in order to make these changes on these compulsions. Today, I want to show you how to actually forge that perspective that suits you and how to get into the space to actually do that. Now, before we get started, my last video, I used a pessimist and an optimist as examples for perspective. But you need to understand that to adopt a better perspective, just being an optimist isn't enough. Learning how to use both is essential. Neither is superior to the other, and just because an optimistic outlook is sort of the benchmark for a positive outlook on life doesn't make it better. I didn't explain it that well in the last video. Honestly, I didn't explain it at all. So I'm gonna clarify right here because this is super important to understand. Humans are motivated by either pain or pleasure. An optimistic perspective used correctly will motivate you towards pleasure by reminding you who you can become if you can learn to harmonize and identify your compulsions. A pessimistic perspective used correctly motivates you away from pain. So what this means is that this will remind you who you will be if you don't decide to harmonize and identify your compulsions. In any situation, decide who you want to be and alternate between the two perspectives depending on what the situation calls for. All right, so welcome to Mindset Redo. If you're new around here, welcome. Over here, I share with you some unique insights and ideas through my perspective that work for me and might work for you. Also, for additional context on my upcoming videos, highly recommend joining my mailing list down below. You also get some free stuff. So click that first link in the description. So as I said before, this is a continuation of the last video I made. So if you haven't watched that yet, click here. Wait, no, here, click here. Now, quick recap from the last video. So we talked about how our compulsions drive us to make certain decisions. And I use this ball right here to represent that. We also talk about how these compulsions made up our experiences and view of the world. Now, I'm not some neuroscientist or psychologist. I'm not even that smart. This is just the practice of self-awareness and how powerful it is. Just make sure you listen to other people who are obsessed with this topic on top of listening to me too. I might put a few of those people down in the description below. I just share the methods that worked in my life and I document to see where I'm at. And with that being said, I hope these series of videos make you insanely uncomfortable, because that is the best sign that you're moving towards growth. That means you access the space after you have the feeling, but before the action is made. And in this space between feeling and action, your animal brain is starting to panic because it's so used to reacting so quickly to what it feels. Just like a computer program, certain inputs yield certain results, which is why to really take into what I'm saying to improve your life, you have to have the mindset of wanting to change more than wanting to be right. We have to remember, before we even start to make a change, our rationality is going to be in tune with the emotions that we had before. So even if something does seem to make rational sense or logical sense, at the root of it, what's being influenced by that is the initial feelings and emotions you had. When we're in that space, you're in the unknown, and you know you're in this space because you have a feeling of discomfort. That's where you're supposed to work in. We reject what doesn't go in line with what we're initially feeling because we're so convinced our rationality is the smartest thing ever. But we have to be brave enough to question, especially if we're not living how we would like to be living. But it's so hard to question it when we're all told that we're so smart growing up. I mean, why would we engage into a process that makes us feel dumb and uncomfortable? So for the remainder of the series, just sit through the discomfort and understand that on the other side of discomfort is clarity. And if it makes you feel any better, I'm just as comfortable as you. I'm the one filming this. I'm still blind to a lot of my dumb patterns still. Like, do you think I make these videos because I overcame everything and I'm suddenly the most self-aware person on earth? So what you need to understand about this discomfort is that this feeling of discomfort you feel is this space between feeling and action. I've said it like 8 times already, but you need to understand how important this is. Between stimulus and response, there is space. In that space, there is power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom, which is the theme of today's video. I really want to focus in on that space in case you haven't noticed. Because in this space, when you start to feel aggressively uncomfortable, when you're making a shift to your identity and perspectives, that is where you're going to be able to strengthen your will, as you'll see in the story that I'm going to share with you a little bit later on. And that's why this series is being made, to remind you and me that between our compulsions and actions, there is space that we can choose. Now, at first, this space between what you feel and then what you do next is very, very tiny. So in the last video when I was talking about how we're a slave to our compulsions, that's why. The space between our compulsions, what we do next, is so small, to the point where it seems like we just have no will. If you never put in time to increase the space, you'll always be a victim to fate. Putting in the work and getting used to being in that space is how we grow and gain will. Because will is not free. That is the cost. The trick I learned is to figure out how we're all actually just truly just dumb, and to just acknowledge that we're dumb without being insecure about being dumb. Because when we think we're really smart, we're not ever gonna wanna be in that space. When we can let go of that fear and actually put energy into becoming smarter. I see the irony in this, okay? I know this entire video is scripted, even that last part. I wrote that down. But if it wasn't, none of this would make sense. So that's honestly more for your benefit than it is for my ego. But do you know how dumb I feel talking to a camera for an hour? But I do this so I can exist in that space and open it up and get used to being uncomfortable. So then when the time comes for the stimulus to arrive and action to happen, I'll be able to widen that space. So if you were confused about what I explained about in the first episode on perspective and whatnot, makes it so that we're a slave to cause and effect that ultimately decides our own fate. It absolutely does if we don't know how to open up that space between feeling and action. I've used this to quit so many terrible behaviors. Although this shift has to happen on the deepest of all levels, and that's your identity. You have to look at yourself as a type of person that wouldn't do certain things to hold you back. And depending on what your goals are, you're gonna know what those things are. We have to enlarge the space so we could fill it with things that will benefit us long term and align with our goals and values. And we must interrogate ourselves and find out why we deserve better before the time for action comes. Because once the action is set, you can't reverse it, and you've created a destiny in line with what compulsions push you to do that action. It will have a residual effect on what's to come later on. Escapism is really the avoidance of that space between feeling and action. If we're not careful, it might turn to things like drinking, weed, porn, hanging out with toxic people, social media, and indulge in it to the point where it takes over our life. And because it comes so automatic, we don't even realize how it's affecting us. It becomes the norm. And I promise you, it will be the most painful thing to be in that space once you identify what your compulsions actually are. But the reward for facing that space that you're trying to escape from and change within this space will be so worth it. I swear to God, don't worry, don't worry. All I want you to understand is that those people like Elon Musk or whoever, the next billionaire, Jeff Bezos, you know, bald guy, Amazon, a lot of them just have a larger space between their stimulus and response. And unconsciously and consciously, they did that by facing their fear of being in that space. By repeating the cycle of emotion and instant action. Eventually, we lose our will to our subconscious, creating a program in your mind that you begin to follow. And this is how you fall on the trajectory of fate. And 20 years later, you wonder how you got to where you are. Again, I'm 23. Oh yeah, and side note, if you can't go 60 days without doing something that you know is not good for you, but you've been doing it because, you know, moderation, that's how you know you've been using it to indulge in escapism. We think it's just drugs that we can get addicted to, but we can get addicted to anything that causes this little molecule called dopamine to fire. And since we all have different wiring, there's even some people who get addicted to even licking cats. I'm just trying to say that there's things beyond your awareness, okay? Led by your unconscious mind. If we don't pay the cost of gaining will, our future will be influenced by a collection of hypercharged emotional experiences that happened in our past, because we suited these hedonistic pursuits in the present. What I'm trying to say is that we can change first and then get the hedonistic pursuits later. You're gonna see the benefit of doing it in that order through this story I'm gonna share with you of Anton Chekhov. I want you to pay attention to how he changed his fate. Focus on where in the story Anton creates that space between stimulus and response. And this story is a little fucked up, I have to warn you. But it sums up exactly what I'm trying to convey when I talk about changing your perspective on the bundle of unchangeable experiences, and to open up that space between your compulsion and what you decide to do next. This is yet another story by Robert Greene. You gotta get that guy's books, okay? You don't understand. Like, you guys gotta start reading this stuff. Holy shit. Anyways, to give you a background to Anton's life, he had 6 siblings and a father by the name of Pavel. Pavel would beat them pretty much every single day if it came without warning or cause. And on top of that, Pavel forced all of his children to work in his meat shop during cold Russian winters. So much so that Anton and all the other kids missed out on their entire childhood. They didn't even really have the freedom to end up going to school. Get this though, Anton's father didn't strike them or treat them terribly out of hate. From Pavel's perspective, this was a form of love. What he would tell his kids, he would be like, that's how my father treated me, and look how perfect I turned out. That's a key point to keep in mind. Pavel was not perfect in any way, although he believed he was. He was literally a walking contradiction. He was lazy, he was an alcoholic, very dishonest with his customers, and walked around with superiority bias, blind to his own compulsions that was affecting his children. Pavel would do all those things and then go to Anton and tell him that he was lazy by nature and only through hard work that he could become a respectable citizen. Anton started to embody this and accept that this is who he was. But in the very few moments Anton had to be alone with himself after his family's weekly visits in church, he would usually go for these walks where he'd have time to think and ponder about what was going on. That's where he really thought to himself, damn, do I really deserve this? But it wasn't enough time for him to be in that space, because as Anton got older, this sense of worthlessness he had, he filled in that space with humor. At first it started off playful, but then the jokes started to become a little bit more cruel. Anton himself then started to become quite impish and lazy. I don't know if you've seen the joke or anything, but if you guys...
What's so funny?
It's just thinking of a joke.
Do you want to tell it to me?
You wouldn't get it.
But after watching this video, I'd highly recommend you guys watch that movie, because it's one of the greatest stories ever told when it comes to the dark side of how someone's terrible experiences can really affect their perspective. A few years passed and some stuff went down. Anton's two older brother, Alexander and Nikolai, got fed up and left the household to make an attempt to create more space between the stimulus Pavel was giving them on a daily basis. Coincidentally, around this time, Pavel had to confront his mismanagement of the meat shop. He piled up so much debt over the years, now the bills were finally due. Facing bankruptcy and almost definitely prison, without even telling his wife, this man escaped to Moscow, away from their little house back in Tarang. I don't remember the name of the city, and forced himself into living with the very sons that left the place because of him. Anton's mom was forced to sell all of the family's possessions. Pavel used his court connection to swindle the entire family out of their house. Anton's mom was then forced to leave with the other children, and Anton was put in a position where he had to negotiate a deal with the new owner so he could stay in Tarag and continue his studies. I know that's probably not the city name, okay? The new owner gave Anton a corner of the room to live in. And at the age of 16, with no money, no family, no one around them, he was forced to fend for himself. Naturally, being trapped alone, Anton felt angry, bitter, depressed, forced in the space between stimulus and response. In this space, he soon realized he actually just didn't have time to feel this way. No money, and hired himself to as many families as possible to tutor their children. As he started to tutor and work towards his dream of becoming a doctor, his mind began to soar far past the misery that Pavel caused in the past. And he started to love absorbing his mind in the studies, and along the way he even developed a passion for writing and philosophy too. At this point, Anton could finally relax and take care of him. Keep in mind, at this point, he's living in a tiny corner of his old family's house that everyone got kicked out of, and his dad left and swindled the family out of his house. But in this corner, he took pride of it, kept it nice and tidy. Now, when I say perception is everything, I'm just saying, you know, don't take my word for it. Months after his initial abandonment, while on a walk, he was suddenly overcome with a feeling of empathy, but a feeling of empathy towards Pavel, his father. How was this possible? His dad terrorized him for so long. Well, in the days leading up to this moment, he was thinking long and hard about his father and began to understand Pavel's perspective. Pavel's father, Igor, was born into serfdom, which is a form of slavery. Eventually, Igor was able to buy his family's freedom and leave this form of slavery, although the pain from being in the slavery lingered inside Igor, even once he was free. After Igor bought his freedom for his family, he set his sons up in different fields, and Pavel was designated as the family merchant. But Pavel had an artistic temperament. He could have easily been a talented musician or a painter. He felt bitter at his fate. A meat market and 6 kids. Igor had beaten Pavel, so Pavel had beaten his kids. Anton could see that he and his siblings were following a pattern of Igor and Pavel. Of his 6 siblings, his brothers, Alexander and Nikolai, The two that tried to escape from Pavel, and Pavel ended up going there anyways, had ended up falling into alcoholism. The alcoholism eventually led Nikolai to his death. Now that Anton was alone and able to take care of himself, Anton yearned to be free in the truest sense of the word. He wanted to be free of the past, free of his father. Now as he walks the street of Taganrog, answer came to him through these new and sudden emotions. Understanding his father, his perception had shifted. Going back to doing those walks he did as a child to create that space, he was able to not react to how he's been reacting to the stimulus that Pavel brought upon him his entire life. What his father did to him in the past cannot be changed, and it would have a long-lasting effect on Anton's psyche. And this showed in all of the signs of Anton and his siblings falling in the same fate of alcoholism and bitterness Pavel did. Anton now was able to see his father for what he really was. He understood that the man just felt really helpless, unaware of any way to change the trajectory of his own fate. This realization allowed Anton to change his perception. Anton decided to change his view. He set rules for himself. No more apologizing, no more complaining, and no more blaming. He decided to live his life in work and love and work. He had to spread his message to his family as well as mankind. Through his stories and plays, he started to write after he got really into philosophy and writing. Over time, Anton's new outlook actually succeeded. Alexander, through no easy feat, was slowly able to be weaned off alcohol as he became influenced by Anton's method of creating the space between the trauma and the action. Over time, through Anton's influence, his family started to get better. Anton decided to continue with his writing and actually became a celebrated author. Although, let's face it, I don't think anything happened to the dad. But the rest of the family did get better through Anton's influence. Clearly the cliff notes of the story, but I wanted you to see the relationship between the illusion of faith and free will and the illusion of free will and fate. The happy middle ground between what both those philosophies have is called self-awareness. Changing the image of self by altering his own perceptions, by facing his fear of the past that almost made up the same compulsion that were close to making Anton repeat the same fate that Pavel and his brother Nikolai faced. That is how you start to begin to change your bundle of compulsions. These guys right here, and in turn change you. So the last thing we need to talk about now is how do we actually address this icky stuff that we don't want to look at? How can we even find these compulsions the same way that Anton did? Especially if we spent so much time burying it as sort of a defense mechanism. So in my next video, we're going to talk about how to actually identify this ball of you and where to look to find it. Of course, we're getting to the nitty-gritty and talk about how to pull an Anton Chekhov. On some level, our stories are similar to Anton. Might be worse, but more likely than not, probably not as severe. Just like his father and his brother Nikolai. We tend to mask the past with things like alcohol, drugs, gaining status, social media, anything that can give us that quick dopamine hit to allow us to escape from feeling the pain that we're always trying to avoid. What needs to happen is that we need to become honest on why we decide to keep using these things over and over again and how we can actually live without them and push through the fear of facing it and to do what Anton did to end up living your best life. He was constantly faced with that same stimulus of his father being toxic to him. But in those walks that he did as a kid and in that final walk that he did when he was older, he gave himself the space to change the next action you take. Once you start quitting these compulsions, your brain's automatically going to want to latch on to something else. And fortunately, in Anton's case, it was studies and writing. But you can do the exact same thing too. Self-awareness and will is built in that space. I hope in this you can see the level of terror that you can go through. Still, by acknowledging your initial story, you can make a change. In the last video of this little series, we're going to look at the parts of our stories we can look at to start to get into this mindset. So I'll see you soon. Thanks for sticking around.